Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon and welcome back to the latest installment of this endless series, 1979. Now, 1979 was another hell of a year for amazing horror, giving us pretty much everything from what is easily one of the best sci-fi horror movies ever made to a very bizarre and original new franchise starter. You had a very coldly grotesque body horror epic, a gut-munching gore masterpiece, two stellar, though very different adaptations of the same classic novel, and you had one of the OG based on a true story haunted house movies. Now, because I, once again, had trouble narrowing down my favorites from 1979 to just five, I'm gonna have like several honorable mentions. And these include the John Badham movie, Dracula, his adaptation of Dracula, which was really awesome, kind of like an elegantly gothic sort of take on it, kind of a more romantic love story kind of thing. Werner Herzog did kind of a more creepy and like a more disease-ridden, plague-ridden kind of take on it, which was called Nosferatu the Vampire. You had Abel Ferreira's sort of gritty and blackly comic psychological horror kind of slasher movie also, which was called The Driller Killer. You also had the kind of underrated and very unsettling supernatural slasher, Tourist Trap, and the iconic psychological thriller slash police procedural movie that was based on an urban legend, When a Stranger Calls. So all of those very worthy entries, but now let's get into my top five from 1979. So I feel like this one, you knew this one was going to end up on the list. This is not only one of the best horror movies ever made, but also one of the best movies ever made, period. So obviously directed by Ridley Scott, this is a terrifying classic movie that kicked off a franchise that has kind of metastasized across all entertainment media and also spawned one of the most recognizable monsters in popular culture, which of course was conceived and designed by artist H.R. Giger. Now, the design of that alien, incidentally, was probably a big part of what made this movie have such a massive cultural impact. I feel like no one had really seen anything that looked like that xenomorph before, and I feel like that just kind of like blew everybody away, like when this came out. And I think the monster too, like, had this perfect balance of being super terrifying, but also like kind of realistic. Like, in other words, it was clearly a monster, but you could easily believe, on the other hand, that this was an actual creature that had evolved to take advantage of its unique environment. And the characters in Alien are also one of my favorite things about it. I mean, Sigourney Weaver's Ripley is an utter badass, obviously, and was hugely influential in regards to strong female protagonists, like, going forward. But it was also great that she had enough, like, compassion, enough humanity to go back and save the ship's cat, Jones, which, not gonna lie, is totally something I would have done too, alien or no. I'm not leaving the cat behind. It's not happening. And I mean, it wasn't just her. It wasn't just Ripley. I mean, the whole ensemble cast here is just fantastic. Everybody is so natural and their interactions are just so organic. And it really lends credence to the idea that these are really just a bunch of working stiffs that are just kind of like shooting the shit on, you know, another workday, another routine mission that they think is going to be like all the others. Spoiler alert, it's not. You know, the whole concept of like working class people in space, by the way, I kind of feel like that was also like kind of a new concept or something that people hadn't really seen before. And I think it also informed a lot of subsequent science fiction films like that came out after this. I mean, I feel like prior to Alien, most science fiction movies were, you know, like futuristic. Like, you had brave astronauts, that's all the cutting edge technology, just very sterile spaces, like comprised of very slick, clean lines. Everything was very, like I said, futuristic. And I kind of feel like where you just had this thing, I mean, Star Wars had done it a little bit, like with the Millennium Falcon, like looking like kind of like a hunk of junk, like a used future type thing. But I kind of feel like this was, you know, kind of on the vanguard of that type of thing. So, I mean, making a sci-fi movie with the equivalent of a crew of long-haul truckers was really kind of refreshing, and I feel like it went a long way toward making the film a lot more relatable and therefore scarier to the average person because they were just working Joes like you were. It just happened to be in space. And have I mentioned also the most important thing is that Alien is also scary as shit. I mean, everything about it is just perfectly realized. It's just, the Nostromo, it's just like all of these creepy darkened corridors, like the alien world they land on, it's just all these kind of like spooky contours about it, like all the stuff they discover, like the way information is kind of slowly doled out and it's never over explained. Like they just land there and you're as in the dark as they are, like finding all these bizarre ass things, and it's great. It really keeps the mystery going. Everything about Alien is a masterpiece. I mean, from the visuals to the characters to the score, everything. And while there could be like a legitimate argument could be made for saying that 1986's Aliens is a better film, and I'm not going to fight with you if you think that, but I mean, in my opinion, the OG Alien is the clear winner. I just feel like it's more of a horror movie. It's like a haunted house style movie set in space, and it has like a horrifying, iconic monster. So I'm always going to give it props for being the first one to do that. I love Aliens as well. And I'm sure that will probably, whenever I get around to doing 1986, I'm sure that will be in my top 5 as well. But that's a more sci-fi action movie, and this one is definitely more a horror movie. And I'm kind of more of a horror movie girl, so I'm always going to fall down on the side of Alien, the first one. So this movie, I think I first saw it. It was directed by Stuart Rosenberg, by the way, who also did Cool Hand Luke, which I don't know why I thought that was weird, but it is. So I first saw this movie when I was 8 or 9 years old, and it scared the absolute bejesus out of me. I don't really know why, but it did. Especially, I think the bits with Jody, like the pig creature, like whose red eyes can be seen outside the window sometimes. Also, that whole nightmare that Kathy Lutz has about her husband, like, axing her to death, that always freaked me the fuck out, too, because axe murders and beheadings and stuff like that were always, like, really, always freaked me out when I was a kid. So whenever I saw that in a movie, I was always like, whoa, you know what I mean? Yeah, so that whole sequence, like, gave me nightmares after I first saw it. Now, obviously, the movie doesn't scare me anymore. I mean, that would be pretty weird if it did. And some parts of it seem ever so slightly cheesy nowadays. I still absolutely adore this movie, and I never get tired of rewatching it. It has, like, this really eerie, like, but also kind of comforting feel to it. I guess, in a way, it's kind of like nostalgia, but I think it holds up, too, just without that, you know what I mean? But it still does, I'm not gonna lie, it still does kind of remind me of being a little kid and curling up in my sleeping bag, like, in the darkened living room, and just kind of, like, happily terrifying the piss out of myself, like, while I was watching this movie. So there is, like, a nostalgia factor to it, too, I guess. So I feel like probably most people are aware of this, but the original Amityville Horror movie was allegedly based on a true story. Or rather, the book that it was based on by Jay Anson was supposedly based on a true story. Now, aspects of the case, of course, are unquestionably true. Ronald DeFeo, for example, absolutely did murder his entire family, his mom, his dad, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters, with a shotgun in November of 1974 at their house in Amityville, Long Island, in New York. He absolutely did claim at his later trial that voices told him to do it, although it isn't really clear if he just said this in order to bolster his insanity defense. I mean, whatever the case for that was, it didn't work anyway. I mean, he was convicted, and he actually ended up dying in prison pretty recently, like only in 2021. It's also absolutely true that the Lutz family moved into the same house in December of 1975, and apparently fled from it only 28 days later, claiming that they had been plagued with violent paranormal activity, like pretty much from the moment they moved in. But I mean, whether the Lutz's account is accurate or not, and I'm kind of like inclined to come down on the side of I think the whole thing was just a cynical hoax just to rake in some dough. But whether it's true or not is like immaterial, because the movie is really effective and really eerie in a way that really only late 1970s haunted house movies can be. Like, some of the performances, not gonna lie, are way over the top. I'm looking at you, Rod Steiger, as Father Delaney. But I still kind of love that, though. It's just very, very over the top, but I'm kind of into it. And I mean, the whole movie does kind of have that late 70s, like, TV movie vibe to it. But for some reason, that whole, like, gestalt, it just makes it a lot more endearing to me. And I would argue that some of the sequences, like the stuff that I was mentioning earlier about the whole Jody situation, the axe murder dream, the discovery of that red room, like behind the wall in the basement, the flashbacks to the DeFeo murders where the guy's going around shooting everybody in the back of the head while they're sleeping, George Lutz's like disturbing change of personality, I think they're still pretty scary. And I think the movie works as well as it does still, like to this day, because it doesn't overly rely on special effects. It kept like most of the paranormal manifestations pretty low key and pretty simple. It's like, oh, the walls are bleeding, or it's just it wasn't like a lot of CGI. Like I mean, obviously they didn't have CGI back then, but it wasn't a lot of over the top stuff like that. A lot of it was a lot more subtle, and I think that's why it hasn't aged in the same way that maybe something from the 2000s or in the 90s or something like that would have done, that had like a bunch of CGI and like jump scares and shit like that in it. And I mean, whatever it was, the formula obviously worked, because the Amityville Horror, the first movie, spawned an entire franchise. Though I have to say that a lot of the subsequent films, I haven't seen them all because there's like a million. I don't know how many there are. I think there's 19, maybe. But the thing about it is that they're not all like sequels, or they're not all related, because the thing about it is Amityville Horror, it was a true story. So you don't really need to, unless you're doing the thing that's based on the Jay Anson book, you don't really need the rights to it as far as I'm aware. So you can just kind of make your own thing and call it the Amityville whatever. You know what I mean? Because there's no copyright on that. But I kind of feel like, so a lot of them don't do a lot of anything with the Lutz case or have anything to do with that. The second one, though, Amityville 2, The Possession, that actually was a loose retelling of the DeFeo murders, with just like the names and the details and the time period changed. And that's actually, it's not a terrible movie. It's actually worth watching if you're interested in it. And you know what? I didn't even mind the 2005 remake that had Ryan Reynolds in it. It wasn't bad. But I mean, to be honest, I don't think anybody else could hold a candle to James Brolin and Margot Kidder as the Lutzes in the first one. And the whole 70s vibe of the story makes it especially relevant to me, because I guess because I was around the same age as the kids in the movie were when I first saw this thing, so I could easily put myself in their shoes, and that made it like a lot freakier to me. So this obviously isn't the first time that David Cronenberg has appeared in this series, but I'm going to say that, in my opinion, The Brood from 1979 is his first, like, fully realized film. This is when he came into his own, I guess, as David Cronenberg, you know what I mean? And still to this day, this is one of my favorite movies of his. Now, The Brood was actually inspired by David Cronenberg's then recent and very acrimonious divorce that he's just been going through. So in this story, he spins this very Cronenbergian tale. It's very clinical. Like I said, a lot of his kind of stuff is. And it's about this shady mental health facility that has the utterly fabulous name of the Soma-Free Institute of Psychoplasmics, which that's the most Cronenbergian. I want somebody to form a band that's called that, and they do like all these weird like body horror type songs. That would be so fucking awesome. But yeah, so that's like the name of it. And it's run by a psychotherapist named Hal Raglan, who is played by Oliver Reed, who is always like amazing. I always love him and everything. So yeah, so this guy's methods are, shall we say, a little bit unorthodox. So the Institute's mission statement, what they're supposed to be doing is they're trying to purge people of their suppressed emotions by encouraging them to manifest these emotions physiologically, which is just as weird as it sounds. Like, the whole concept of this seems to be like a winking parody of the various kind of wacky, sometimes questionable, usually navel-gazing self-help theories that were kind of littering the landscape during the 1970s. They didn't call it the Me Decade for nothing. So it's kind of like, I feel like it's slyly poking fun at that a little bit. So at the heart of the story, you have a divorcing couple named Frank and Enola, who are played by Art Hindle and Samantha Eggar, who is great in this, respectively. And they're going through this prolonged custody battle over their daughter, Candace. Now, the child actor that plays Candace, she was in a whole bunch of, I don't know if a whole bunch, but a bunch. Cindy Hines, I think her name was, but she was in a couple of subsequent horror movies as a kid. Like, she was in Deadline from 1980, which I think we reviewed on my other channel like a long time ago, and The Dead Zone from 1983, which was also directed by David Cronenberg and obviously was based on the Stephen King novel. So yeah, she was in a lot of horror as a child actor. So after Nola's mom, Juliana, and a couple other people are savagely murdered by what appears to be a small child or a dwarf of some kind, It's eventually revealed that while undergoing her therapy sessions, Nola has channeled all of her trauma from her abusive childhood into birthing literal babies, which are kind of like, they're kind of become known as children of rage, all of whom were born parthenogenetically, and basically go after and kill anyone who Nola is mad at, with like Nola not really knowing much of anything about what they're up to. I mean, it's such a weird premise. I mean, yes, we are talking about David Cronenberg. I mean, that's pretty much a given, a weird premise. And the film is overall like pretty grotesque and like pretty unpleasant, but you know, on the other hand, it's just exceptionally well made. It's very absorbing, and it has like this streak of black humor that always kind of like, that really made it appeal to me. Besides that, I've always really been a sucker for kind of like killer kid type movies, which this sort of is. And I'm gonna say that iconic scene toward the end with Samantha Eggar like licking the afterbirth off of the infants, like, and she's just, if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, that whole scene is just like the stuff of legend, and I heard that was her idea, like the actress's idea. She's like, hey, I was just doing like an animal, like licking the afterbirth up, like while she's looking at the person. It's just like, it's so freaky. And interestingly, when this movie came out, it was lambasted pretty soundly for being morally reprehensible and sickening, which, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess it is. But I'm going to say I think time has been really kind to it, and it's has these underlying themes of repression, like bogus mental health treatments, and fear of parenthood. And I think like all of those themes are more relevant than ever. And so, I mean, if you're into David Cronenberg's later work and you haven't seen The Brood, I feel like this is the first definitively Cronenbergian movie. And again, like, it's one of my favorite ones of his. So this right here, yet another completely bizarro concept that somehow not only just clicked and worked like absolute gangbusters, but also, somewhat surprisingly, spawned a long-running and almost uniformly excellent franchise. It's 5 movies at this point, and they're all good. They're all worth watching. So this was conceived and directed by Don Coscarelli, and this was an ultra-independent movie. And I feel like Phantasm was kind of the rare case of a completely new mythology, pretty much, springing fully formed, like from the mind of its creator, and almost immediately, you know, endearing itself to the horror community at large, which is not something you usually see. I don't know, I just feel like this was an idea that sort of, yes, it took disparate elements from other things, but it was such a wild, out there concept, but everybody just immediately latched onto it, and I don't see that happening very often, so this was kind of like lightning in a bottle. So Phantasm cost only about 300 grand to make, and the first one is admittedly like a little bit rough around the edges. You can tell that it's very independent and very like homemade. But I think the reason that it worked, one of the reasons why it worked, was because it kind of took a handful of just regular, very, very likable characters and sort of plunged them into this surreal nightmare world of just interdimensional beings that were all that much scarier because they were just completely inscrutable. Like, you just knew that you were completely in over your head. You had no idea what was going on. So the concept of the movie apparently came about when Coscarelli was thinking about different cultures' ways of dealing with death, particularly the practice of embalming, which he's like, if you look at that from like, an objective standpoint, it's just like really weird, right? So he was thinking about that. He was also influenced quite a bit by the very dreamlike narrative of Suspiria, the Dario Argento movie, which had come out, back then, had come out 2 years before. It came out in 1977. And also he liked the idea of a young boy being sort of the center of the story, being unable to convince adults that what he feared, like what he could see happening was real, and like nobody believed him. So he got that idea from the original 1953 Invaders from Mars, that movie, and the classic Ray Bradbury novel, Something Wicked This Way Comes, which actually he was going to adapt, but then he couldn't get the rights to it. So if you haven't seen it, Phantasm follows this 13-year-old boy named Mike, who's played by Michael Baldwin, and he starts to suspect that something very, very weird is going on at the local Morningside mortuary after the death of a friend of his older brother. So the deceased person, whose name is Tommy, was actually stabbed by a woman in the cemetery, what you think is a woman, but everybody thinks that he committed suicide. So as Mike kind of continues his investigation into what the fuck is going on at this mortuary, because there's just all kind of weird stuff that he sees, he's following his older brother Jody around and seeing this same mysterious woman that supposedly killed Tommy, luring his brother into the cemetery as well, where Tommy was found dead. So it's revealed that the mortician, known only as the Tall Man, who of course is played by the incredible Angus Scrimm, who is just pants-shittingly frightening in this, and I mean, he just absolutely killed it. He's actually this kind of supernatural, I want to say maybe extraterrestrial, interdimensional kind of being, who essentially steals dead bodies, shrinks them down to dwarf size, and then sends them to his home planet, like via a dimensional portal, where they're put to work as slaves. Now, that sounds dumb as hell if you haven't seen the movie, but holy shit, is it really, really not dumb or cheesy at all when you're actually watching it. I think that the dreamlike way that it's shot and just the incongruity of the imagery just make the whole thing feel like this really, really unpleasant acid trip that you can never really escape from, and I think they really, really nailed that tone. So I mean, just everything about it is creepy, you know what I mean, because you're not entirely sure what's going on, you're not entirely sure what the explanation is, just the interiors of the mortuary are just very sparse and very unsettling, and then you have all these other kind of like real peculiar, like really freakish touches, like you have these little hooded dwarves running around, you have this bright yellow like embalming fluid like coming out of people, bubbling out of people's veins, you have like, you know, obviously the iconic flying spheres with all the spikes and the drills and stuff that embed themselves in people's heads and shit like that, which was an amazing idea. I mean, Phantasm is one of those movies that really has to kind of be experienced to be believed, and the creativity of it, like of coming up with this concept and making it work, I mean, that still takes my breath away, like to this day, even all of this time later. I just think it was such a great idea, and the fact that he was able to pull it off, even though it's really, really weird, and when you explain it to somebody, they'd be like, wait, what? You know what I mean? But it totally, totally works. I also have to give a shout out to the incredible character work here, which, like I said, is one of the reasons why this movie works so well. I mean, obviously, not only is Angus Scrimm, he was an absolute legend, you know, that should go without saying, but you also have the ass-kicking ice cream man and unrepentant bald chick magnet, Reggie Bannister, who is played by a character, like, the actor's name is Reggie Bannister, and, like, the character in the movie is based on the real guy. So he's essentially just, like, playing himself. He is a delight. And it was absolutely the right call to have the rest of the films in the series, which, like I said, there are 5 total of them now, revolve around him, and because he's just so lovable and so goofy and yet so fucking awesome. So look, I mean, I'm a big fan of more cerebral horror, I guess, but sometimes you just want to sit down in front of a movie and watch people's faces get munched off in the most disgusting, graphic way possible. And when you're in that kind of mood, Lucio Fulci is always going to have your back on that. Now, technically, the movie that it's pretty widely known as Zombie over here, but it's usually called Zombie 2, also goes under numerous other names: Zombie Flesh Eaters, Nightmare Island, Island of the Living Dead. Just go to Wikipedia, there's like 7 different names for it. Zombie was actually made as an unauthorized sequel, because that's what they did in Italy, to George Romero's Dawn of the Dead from 1978. So Lucio Fulci's gore masterpiece is kind of, it takes the zombie concept like back to its voodoo roots somewhat. So in that way, it's like a little bit different than like the Romero type zombies. So in this story, you have a character named Anne Bowles, who's actually played by Mia Farrow's sister, Tiza Farrow. And she travels to what I believe is a fictional Caribbean island called Matul to check on her dad, who is some kind of like doctor, research scientist, something like that. He's kind of doing some kind of research down there and has apparently fallen ill with some unknown sickness. So she goes down there with a journalist named Peter, who's played by Ian McCulloch. No, not the lead singer of Echo and the Bunnymen, but Ian McCulloch, who was an actor who was in a bunch of Italian horror movies, even though I think he was British, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, she goes down there with him and a couple of guides. So they get to Matul, And they find out that this illness that everyone's talking about is actually like zombification, essentially. Like, the dead are reanimating, baby. That's what's going on down there. So from there, things go about as well as you'd expect. People get devoured by the zombies left and right. And at the end, it's implied that the zombie outbreak is headed right for the heart of New York City, like via the boat that the survivors used to escape on. Now, I will say that Zombie does have some slow parts, but in spite of that, it is a classic of the zombie subgenre. And it features some of the best zombie makeup and some of the most gruesome kills of any zombie film that you are ever likely to see. The scene with Olga Carlatos, the actress getting her eyeball graphically gouged out with a splinter, is notorious and is still like pretty icky to this day. I mean, like I said, it's iconic for a reason. And honestly, like, how many movies can actually boast of having an epic underwater sequence where a zombie actually fights a shark? Just this one. That's right. Zombie versus shark battle. Only in Zombie by Lucio Fulci. So, like I said, it's probably true to say that Zombie is basically just a few, like, amazing, outstanding scenes linked together with sinews of maybe less interesting filler, perhaps, but that's not even much of a criticism when the iconic scenes in question are this fun and this gooey and fucked up. Although I feel like Lucio Fulci, like particularly in the US, is really beloved for his gore films more than anything, and therefore is almost perceived almost exclusively just through that lens, through a horror movie lens. I think people forget that he was actually like a really accomplished director in lots of different genres. He made movies in lots of different genres, and and just as a visual stylist, like sometimes his shot compositions and stuff like that are actually quite beautiful. And I think that goes a long way toward, because I think when you go in to see a movie like Zombie, or even like some of his other movies like The Beyond or something like that, and you just think it's going to be this kind of schlocky, cheap, Italian knockoff of whatever, but a lot of the movies are actually really, really well made and really, really nice looking, and I think people kind of like forget, and he doesn't really get enough credit for that. They do have like a surprising amount of artistry to them, like despite how grisly and disgusting they are. So, I mean, Zombie is absolutely, if you're into zombie movies, if you're into Italian horror, if you're into just gory horror movies in general, then I mean, Zombie is kind of like a must-see, so... Well, the 1970s have come to an end, so whenever I get around to doing the next video in this series, we're going to be plunging into a new decade. Yeah, we're going to be talking about the 1980s. So hopefully you guys are enjoying these, and, I'm kind of enjoying doing them. Sorry they take me so long to do, but, I have, like, a lot of other ideas I want to do as well. So usually I try to do one of these a month, but, we'll see how it goes. So as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like, share, and comment if you enjoy this content, and please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.
And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed holes of their road, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out without